a vocês, apesar do dia imprensado de hoje, mas já estamos aqui a postos, todos trabalhando. Também é dia de finados nos Estados Unidos, é o dia deles também. É uma coisa universal, porque é da igreja, mas todos nós estamos aqui prontos para trabalhar e para ouvir mais uma vez a excelente conferência do professor Frederick Kellogg. Muito obrigado. Okay, Kellogg, you can go ahead.
Good morning. This is the 5th lecture in a series of 9 lectures on the subject, Democracy and Conflict, how we govern ourselves between elections. We ended last week talking about resolving conflicts through transformation of what I call the reasons environment. What does that mean and how did we get there? Let me give you a recap. In doing so, I should first recognize that today, of course, is an important religious event in the life of the Christian Church. It is All Saints' Day, and it follows All Hallows' Day, and it precedes tomorrow All Souls' Day. All 3 days carry the great Christian theme of bringing light from darkness. We haven't talked much about religion in these lectures, but it is part of the reality underlying moral theory, which is our topic today. Ever since the European Enlightenment, there has been an effort by philosophy to establish a secure, secular foundation for morality. Utilitarianism was one main avenue, and the other 2 leading avenues are the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, focusing on rational principle, and the idea of social contract between citizens and the government, which comes mainly from Thomas Hobbes. Today we will focus on utilitarianism. Is social conflict a problem? For many theologians and priests, conflict is something to be avoided. Yet, still, there is conflict in All Hallows Tide, of course, between the power of light against the power of darkness. My thesis is that dispute and conflict, despite the extraordinary polarization dividing our society, has a constructive role in our lives, and we must understand it better. This is not a simple project. That's why we need 9 lectures. Dispute and its resolution take us further than just the world of elections and political theory. They take us beyond just law and legal disputes. As I suggested last week, they take us into the fundamentals of moral philosophy. Why? Because understanding conflict requires understanding the whole of human conduct, language, knowledge, and their ethical roots, our moral foundations. So we might wonder on All Saints' Day whether understanding social conflict might bring some light to the darkness of our great polarization. Last week we discussed John Dewey's difficulty in communicating his mission to extend what he called empirical naturalism to morals and ethics. This meant extending the methods of science with its grounding in experience to the realm of values. Few people in his lifetime were able to fully comprehend his meaning. We examined it through the 1981 book by Alistair MacIntyre called after virtue. MacIntyre writes about the long history of our ethical and moral knowledge, and he concludes that it is seriously deficient. He writes, quote, "The language of morality is in a state of grave disorder. What we possess, if this view is true, are fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality." That's a very serious charge. MacIntyre would take us in a different direction than John Dewey, toward Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. But he shared important insights with Dewey about the character of our ethical knowledge. In the beginning of his book, After Virtue, he imagines that sudden catastrophe in which science is suddenly undermined by a deviant but massive revolution. In this way, the society has lost its historical connection with prior scientific inquiry and its history. Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Einstein, the books and historical roots are destroyed, leading to a loss of historical perspective. But then MacIntyre imagines an attempt to put it all back together, to understand scientific knowledge from the disconnected bits and pieces, the remains of the formulas and terminology. He observes that doing this is hopeless. The roots of experience are gone. It is a lost world. His point was not about science, but morals. He claimed that this scenario is close to the status of ethical and moral knowledge in our time. We have the formulas and the terminology, but they are not connected with real human experience, which has fundamentally changed with new kinds of ethical experience. We are in a lost world of moral philosophy. I said MacIntyre could have learned much from a better understanding of John Dewey. Dewey's writing can be difficult, and he didn't study Dewey. Instead, he placed Dewey within this lost world. He could have studied how Dewey actually shows a way out of it through the continuum of normative inquiry. It is not an automatic way out. Dewey's empirical naturalism is not an ideal theory of morals, a system leading dependably to solutions and answers. It depends instead on human effort and creativity in the resolution of problems. The continuum leads in many possible directions, and by no means are all of them purely secular. In fact, to give you a glimpse of the conclusion that we reach by the end of these lectures, there is an important and quite extraordinary parallel between the underlying ethic of empirical naturalism and that of religion. In understanding the lost world of morals, we need to examine what MacIntyre had in mind and how we have lost this connection. MacIntyre actually sees the value of conflict in an essay that he wrote on toleration. on toleration and the goods of conflict. He talks about conversations that occur when a group of individuals inquire together about how it would be best for them to act so that some good can be achieved or some evil avoided. He writes, so the good of this or that household or neighborhood, this or that workplace or school or clinic, this or that orchestra or laboratory or chess or football club. The central aim, he says, of this type of conversation is to arrive at as large a measure as possible of agreement that will issue in effective practical decision-making. Such conversations, he says, are a feature of any flourishing form of everyday social life. They are also characteristically and not surprisingly scenes of conflict. So MacIntyre says conflict is therefore as integral to the life of such groups as conversation. When MacIntyre talks about what was lost from the world of morals, what's the evidence? I try to give some examples. One, of course, is the problem that Dewey encountered from conservatives who exalted moral absolutes and called him a relativist. This was not a real conversation in MacIntyre's sense. It was more like a shouting match. Conflict is not necessarily shouting. It's factual when it's working the best. Moral absolutes, or fundamental values, are themselves always in conflict. For any real problem, there's always at least two opposing each other, as in assisted death, with the right to privacy against the right to life. But nevertheless, we see a wide practice of relativist bullying even today. For Dewey, that would be a failure comparable to a scientific error. I said last week that this error was connected to the false notion of indeterminacy instead of seeing it as uncertainty. But the bullying problem is just the tip of the iceberg in defective moral thinking. Beneath it are a multitude of other issues and assumptions in the literature of academic moral philosophy. To understand it fully will take us through the major themes of analytical moral philosophy, and it involves terminology with which many of you may not be familiar. Such terms as moral generalism, particularism, moral dilemmas, and names of authors like Bernard Williams, R.M. Hare, W.D. Ross, Philippa Foot, John Rawls, and others. Many of them are British. You might say Britain is the home of analytical moral theory. Pragmatism has been both ignored and misconceived by them. A dominant issue is the question of generalism and particularism. Can we understand ethics as a set of general principles like Kant? Or must we depend on particular facts and reasons? Ask yourself, do you act from general rules or particular interests? How do you act ethically? There is enormous literature on this, and in order to understand pragmatism fully, it is necessary to dig into it. I will do my best to keep it interesting, but it can get rather technical. But I think it will be profitable for you, as many of you will encounter academic moral philosophy in your studies. McIntyre writes in After Virtue that, quote, the most striking feature of contemporary moral utterance is that so much of it is used to express disagreements, and the most striking feature of the debates is their interminable character. I do not mean by this just that such debates go on and on and on, although they do, but also that they apparently can find no terminus. There seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture. End quote. You will see that this is a feature of the issue of generalism and particularism, which we explore next week. Another leading issue in academia is that of moral dilemmas. These are carefully balanced imaginary situations designed to test our moral intuitions. The trolley problem is a leading example. That's the situation where you are the driver of a light rail vehicle called a trolley, which is approaching 5 workmen on the track just ahead. You apply the brakes and they fail. Hitting the workmen would not be your fault, but rather a maintenance failure. But then you see a connection to another track ahead that you could switch over to and avoid hitting the 5 workmen. But there is one workman on that other track, and striking him would not be purely a maintenance failure. It would involve an intentional act by you. What should you do? This example, the trolley problem, has led to another interminable debate. Next week, we'll examine it more carefully. But first, we need to get a full, detailed understanding of Dewey's continuum of pragmatic inquiry. We also need to keep in mind the underlying issue of human freedom, as this is deeply connected with morals. You might say the engine driving us is our ethics and our morals. Etzioni said, if preferences are fixed, we are doomed. But Roberto Unger said, there is no limit to our possibilities. Much of our freedom is governed by habit. Last week, we began a detailed analysis of the nature of social conflict and its path through uncertainty to possible resolution. The question of ethical knowledge is tied up with the problem of human freedom and the potential for transformation of embedded habits. A revolution in habits, such as the recent rejection of sexual or racial aggression and discrimination, encounters reaction. So the question of freedom will require understanding conflict and its resolution. These lectures began with 3 short quotations from Kenneth Arrow, Friedrich Hayek, and John Dewey that framed the problem. How does democracy work? Is it only through the popular vote and elected representative governments? Arrow and Hayek both said that is rationally impossible. Arrow applied formal logic and proved that you cannot order a society of diverse preferences. Hayek said the order of society cannot be directed rationally as it is too complex and can only be ordered spontaneously. So both conclusions are that there is no possibility of human freedom. John Dewey sought a possible realistic solution to the impossibilities, which is transformation. Transformation of Arrow's fixed preferences and Hayek's fixed customs. Dewey brought a completely different view of rationality and logic, which is what we explore in a comparison with utilitarianism. Both Arrow and Hayek assume that preferences are surrounded by reasons and that those reasons are inflexible. We mentioned Roberto Unger's view that there is no necessity preventing society from radical change. But Unger doesn't tell us how to get through uncertainty, and he doesn't address the problem of resistant preferences. So let's get back to where we left off last week. We ended with the need for transformation of what might be called the reasons environment, with particular controversial moral questions like medical-assisted death. The reasons environment is like those conversations we talked about just now, about neighborhoods and activities, the assessment of problems, what concerned people are arguing about them in real time and over time. For assisted death, the reasoning really increased with the conviction of Dr. Kevorkian 25 years ago, with only two choices, murder or suicide. But now the conversations and arguments include many new considerations. Transformation of reasoning is the core of the pragmatist view of rationality. This problem could never be resolved by the original standoff between murder or suicide, but it has given way to the identification and application of numerous detailed practical issues like improved medical technology, living wills, where a patient signs in advance it's his or her concerns about death or life or medication, and ultimately local legislation, taking all these new reasons into account. Thus, we have a window through law into the transformation process of the reasons environment. Other examples of transformation in legal conflict are many. I will later use a simple example used by Justice Holmes of traffic regulation to show how ethical situations are classified or reclassified. We need to see how conduct and habit is influenced by social conflict. While Arrow and Hayek gave legislation little hope, Dewey suggested that there must be a way forward. His thought addressed problems and how they are solved by experience. Last week, we began to see that Dewey's view of philosophy and of democracy was different from the leading forms of the 20th century. He advanced a philosophy of continuous inquiry, not fixed analysis. But he was misunderstood and called a relativist by conservatives. He failed to turn his empirical naturalism into an understandable and persuasive account, reaching into values and ethics. I want to address and answer that failure. I asked why he was so misunderstood and commented that his position lacked specificity and also the richness of agonistic inquiry into problems. I said he might have gained insight in responding to his critics from an older pragmatist, Justice Holmes, a Civil War veteran and an expert on conflict. Today, I bring the two pragmatists, Dewey and Holmes, together in a comparison with utilitarianism. This is a venerable theory that we look mainly to the consequences of our actions, and it's one of the three secular paths in moral theory: utilitarianism, principle, and social contract. Within the insight of transformation lies Holmes' original contribution to what we call normative induction, the process through which society either hammers out consensual resolutions to opposing views of utility or descends into civil violence, as it did in 1861. This will affect our assessment of both utilitarianism and mainstream ethical theory, and indeed of pragmatic ethics. So we must take a close look at utilitarian theory today. The term for it is now consequentialism. And it is easy to confuse pragmatism with that view. Normative induction is how the discovery of new knowledge takes place and new ethics. To explain it, I advanced three themes. First, new moral knowledge is generated in conflict of conduct as well as opinion. Second, this often requires extension in both time and space. The extension of time and within society. Ethical inquiry is a product of broad experience throughout society and often requires considerable time to reach stability. Finally, this is because it requires transformation of conduct as well as of discourse and persuasion for resolving serious conflicts, if they are to be fully resolved at all. The human world is one of problems. Ethics and morals are rooted in habits and affected by problems. So ethics and habits are affected by conflict. They cause conflict and they resolve conflict. Habit change is a key issue, including habitual thinking about life itself for patients in deep pain and illness. Dewey addressed this in his response to critics. Change can come through conflict, but the conflict must address the reality of the problem. Thus, the problem itself must be recognized, fully explored, and opened up. I think that is what the prosecution of Dr. Kevorkian started for assisted death in 1999, and what Miko Kawakami wants to do with bullying in her novel, Heaven, which with its focus on both bullying and relativism. There is a new kind of moral challenge that she depicts, the challenge of bringing real problems to the forefront. Utilitarianism is still present in conventional moral and political theory. It is a dominant influence, focusing on consequences, but not to be confused with pragmatism's recognition of extended social inquiry, which is a form of logical induction. In his writings on law, Justice Holmes is actually the father of normative induction. His contribution, not just to utilitarian theory, but to legal and ethical logic, is original, outside the analytical canon that has so long dominated moral theory. Even as the young Holmes was returning as a soldier from the American Civil War, utilitarian theory in England was being refined through the works of John Stuart Mill and the famous Henry Sidgwick. Holmes's attitude toward it must have been affected by his experience of war. He developed his overall perspective in the years immediately following the American Civil War, and the specter of that conflict hangs over it. Utility itself is in constant dispute. The classic utilitarian calculus, a balance of good and bad consequences to resolve a dispute. But this ignores the realities of real social conflict. For Holmes, dispute resolution was fundamentally precarious and required a new logic of contingency and experiment. These insights were drawn from the details of legal history, which served as an empirical context for understanding normative inquiry. So you see, the difference between utilitarianism is that it calculates the good and bad at an instant, whereas Holmes's continuum looks at the process through which utility is defined and characterized and classified and altered and adjusted. Holmes was also reading about natural science and recent controversies over scientific and logical method, and attending lectures by his friend Charles Peirce, the father of pragmatism, on the logic of science, or induction and hypothesis. So his reading and many discussions with other young pragmatists shaped his early essays on law, which in 1870 and 1873 produced the approach to legal logic that I have called social inductivism or normative induction. Utilitarians acknowledge that utility may be disputed, but ultimately they assume that conflicts can be resolved through a utilitarian calculus, originally an accounting of aggregate pleasure and pain. The idea of omniscient measurement has always been problematic, from the lack of anything like a purely speculative omniscient measurer. It's an ideal theory. Yet actual normative life is replete with constantly changing standards of measurement. Measurement must and does indeed take place. The challenge is understanding how. As I want to demonstrate, the context of calculation, the environment of normative reasons, is hardly static. And along with transformation of normative practice comes transformation of meanings defining expected utility. Opposing views or expectations of utility are not reconciled by constant tallying and balancing, but by and through adaptation with the adjustment of habits and practices. So, society does not always work out conflict through a legislative calculus, as Arrow and Hayek presume, but often by redefining or replacing the terms and forms of calculation in disputed, problematic contexts. How does civilization survive constant conflict? It requires the retirement of incommensurable reasons, of impossible to reconcile reasons, not the forcing of choices among them. This is precisely what Kenneth Arrow fails to recognize in his general impossibility theorem of 1951. Now, this discussion can get technical, but if you're patient, we'll try to get through it, and I'll explain. So let's approach this through another distinction: utilitarianism as a form of synchronic moral analysis, that is, immediate moral analysis, and pragmatism as a study of convergent change and adaptation. Analytical normative theory assumes a static conceptual universe for the purpose of utility analysis. Pragmatism, rather than applying an instantaneous consequentialism, assumes that analysis of any difficult moral question may be influenced by its relative position or stage in the discovery and completion of a broader and more general question. In other words, inquiry into the specific ethical question, let's call it the small q, what is right to do now, often comes within an extended continuum, which we'll call a capital Q. So here's the picture: the small q, many of the small q, and the capital Q, which is the bigger, larger question. Now, note that the individual Q, the first Q, may be early or late in the larger and longer extended social inquiry of the capitalized Q. When a particular Q first arrives, the full nature of the possibly extended capital Q remains yet unspecified. The larger question is still uncertain. An example is assisted death, which began as a standoff between suicide and homicide. And Dr. Kevorkian sought to raise a broader question by devising that device for a patient for which he was prosecuted and imprisoned in 1991. And it was minimal medical assistance to a severely ill patient. And that was the tension that opened up the question. His case was thus an early question. A generation later, after extended social inquiry into many instances of what is now the complex and painful question of assisted death, forced open by Kevorkian, the larger issue, the capital Q, has acquired a new utility analysis on both sides. Suicide and homicide no longer dominate the conversation. A specific inquiry today, yet another small q, will take place within a transformed reasons environment. Earlier reasons regarding expected utility have been retired and replaced. Hence, any original q, small q, or indeed any given particular inquiry during the extended period may be an inquiry within an inquiry. A point that is critical to understand social inductivism and its bearing on utilitarian theory. This has an important impact on the notion of rules and rule formation. The retrospective utility calculus for the capital Q will be different from the earlier reasons calculus of the small q in ways yet invisible at the earlier moment, which is like a camera flash taking a picture of that earlier moment. Adaptation and the revision of practices will occur during the social continuum of inquiry, in some matters more readily than others. But as I hope to show, the stages of inquiry and transformation are invisible to this hypothetical instant utility camera. This is not as complicated as it may sound. How does a practice emerge amidst conflict? and how is it affected by further conflict? Take a simple example that Holmes mentions in the 1873 paper, The Emergence of English Rules of the Road. Holmes observed that the rules of the road are practices that have been worked out after a, quote, sufficient amount of fighting, end quote. So let's imagine disputes over vehicular collisions for which, at first, there is no settled rule. I will try to flesh this out from personal experience as both a driver and a former lawyer. In America, we drive on the right. In Britain, they drive on the left. Even so, I am reasonably familiar with the rules that relate to driving a rental car on English streets and highways. For example, in those confusing clockwise roundabouts. Let's ask what might have happened when drivers first entered what might have been an early English roundabout or traffic circle. Going back to that hypothetical time, I imagine myself as the trial counsel, the trial lawyer, representing Mrs. Quickly, who was struck by a lorry when she blithely dashed into that primitive roundabout, assuming, if you will, that there was a complete absence of accepted driver conduct. I will naturally engage in exhaustive discovery to bring up everything in the utilitarian calculus favorable to her case, including her being late to church and the fact that the lorry was carrying a cargo of scandalous literature. Anything to sway the judge or jury. Now, the lawyer for the lorry driver will raise countervailing arguments, such as his client's need for income, and his duty as a professional driver to advance the interests of commerce. This rather absurd caricature serves, nevertheless, to illustrate the early Q, small q, a new conflict over competing utility. In the early or novel case, the list of properties relevant to the utilitarian calculus is long. There are aggravating and mitigating factors everywhere you look on both sides of the case. Holmes's point is that rules begin to be formed from within an environment of yet unregulated disputes. Once a remedial practice and then a reinforcing rule establishes a presumptive right-of-way for any vehicle already in the roundabout, none of the earlier drivers or their lawyers' reasons and arguments will be relevant. They will have been progressively overruled as the general issue is judicially explored and resolved. Generalism in law is a product of establishing a commitment to finite expectations in a given problematic situation. It often occurs at a later stage of inquiry, if and when the relevant properties can be winnowed down to a formula. Habit change is obviously a key issue. It can come with conflict, but the conflict must address the reality of the problem. Thus, the problem itself must be recognized, opened up. I think that is what Miko Kawakami does in her novel Heaven, with its focus on both bullying and the philosophy of relativism. There is a new kind of moral challenge here that she depicts, the challenge of bringing real problems to the forefront. Now, what about exceptions to the rule of right of way? This is a key question for utilitarians. So how does pragmatism address it? Imagine a fire engine on the way to a fire, but with no siren or flashing lights, plunging into the traffic circle, just like Ms. Quickly, but after the yielding rule is in effect. At first, you might expect more crashes, injuries, and disputes, until, that is, an additional practice and later rule is made requiring sirens and flashing lights. Thus does the continuum provide ample room for transformation to accommodate exceptions. Our fate depends on the piecemeal transformation of what is called the reasons environment, doing so with particular controversial moral questions like traffic rules or medical assisted death. These could never be solved by a immediate utilitarian calculus, the original definition of the problem. But it gives way to identification and application of numerous detailed practical issues. Social inductivism simply means that inductive inference is social in actual practice. It is not always performed at once by an individual or idealized objective mind, much less a computer. It is fundamentally pragmatic and contributes to Dewey's own ethical thinking. Holmes's socialized normative induction is an extended process of inquiry, but it is unique in its emphasis on endemic dispute and often outright conflict, driving the continuum of social inquiry and the necessity of convergence of opposing positions and habits to produce a consensual view of the world. To get a more detailed analysis of this pragmatist vision, we are exploring how social conflict leads through uncertainty to resolution. Our overall general knowledge is never complete. It's the product of many inquiries and ongoing problems, constantly transforming the human world piece by piece. This picture can help us understand the difficulty of problem solving, but also its possibility. Within this dappled picture lie the clues to organic democracy, and within it, the methods of self-rule through conflict. Within this picture lie important aspects of human freedom or control and the transformation of preferences. Now, the next part is a little more technical, but it's important to understand how this vision compares to contemporary analytical theory. So I'm going to sketch a current controversy within utilitarianism over the utility calculus. This begins with a debate between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. I said earlier that traditional act utilitarianism is an ideal or perfectionist theory, abstract, general, and flawed. And the flaw has been shown with a well-known criticism that act utilitarianism, the sum total of all acts in their production of happiness, proves too much. John Rawls put this in the context of criminal punishment. The hypothetical case where a judge seeking to maximize happiness punishes an innocent person to stop a crime wave for the greater good of society. Have we heard that before? This response is to recognize the utility of rules Rawls was instrumental in advancing rule utilitarianism, and we will examine an important debate between the two, still active in analytical moral theory. In other words, if people explicitly adopted utilitarianism and tried to follow it, says Rawls, things might very well go worse, as judged by the same utilitarian method, than if people adopted and tried to follow rules instead. In that case, the utilitarian might instead recommend adopting and trying to follow rules. That's rule utilitarianism. And it divides utilitarian theorists who are always seeking a uniform conception. Now, a theory called the Extensionalist challenge caused something of a crisis for modern utilitarianism. It essentially showed that there is little difference between the outcomes of act and rule utilitarianism regarding their results in actual cases. Now, this challenge provides an opening for a better understanding the pragmatist critique and its superior method, the continuum of inquiry, and the fundamentally diachronic or extended in time character of normative inquiry. My task is now to show that a pragmatic moral philosophy with its own distinctive account of grounding rules requires abandoning the momentary flash camera model of normative reality. The difference lies in the utilitarian view that rules grow out of the utilitarian calculus, or whether they grow out of solutions to ongoing problems. An explanation of the alternative account is drawn from Holmes, who was not concerned with utilitarian theory per se, but rather with addressing the real actual process of rule formation in areas like injury, crime, possession, and so on. The insight of Holmes, to be emphasized, is that in an actively disputed legal context, any rule resolving a given dispute, which, as Rawls saw in 1951, rooted in a practice, the practice in effect replaces an earlier unsettled calculus of opposing reasons, and this only happens on successful adaptation. That is, a real and often intractable conflict is at stake, and a potentially continuing conflict. The background of broader conflicts, many yet unresolved, is unrecognized by the analytical model of utilitarianism and the extensionalist challenge. David Lyons, who brought the extensionalist challenge, and other writers wrestling with this problem simply failed to see that previously settled conflicts underlie and explain both acceptance of and compliance with what extensionalism sees as de facto rules. Thus, for Holmes, any exception to the rule, which extensionalism assumes to be based on the original calculus, requires further convergence through resolution of further conflict. So essentially, the difference is this extensionalist challenge, which has riven the theory of utilitarianism into a new conundrum, difficulty, a new interminable argument, which we heard McIntyre call interminable. They go on and never resolve. It has failed to see that the important insight lies in the view of a continuous inquiry of normative induction as happening over time. So I said convergence of opposing purposes is implicit in working out the rules of the road. So I ask, is an exception always already covered? That's what the issue is for utilitarianism. According to David Lyons, and I quote him, if one accepts act utilitarianism, one can view the de facto moral rules as if they have the escape clause as an implicit qualification. That is to say, Rawls's rule argument. Let us assume that an early claim of exception comes from the local fire department. Of course, the rule must adapt to allow a general exception for fire equipment, but a conditional one only when displaying lights and sirens. So that exception was not already anticipated in the utilitarian calculus. That's the problem with the extensionalist challenge to utilitarianism. It assumes that everything has to be seen at once, whereas in fact, everything is developing over time. This ongoing process, which Holmes called specification, is pervasive throughout the law. And it was detailed in his 1870 and 1873 articles. Specification is, of course, more efficient through legislation. But even then, it has usually benefited from repetition of disputes and particular judgments, creating patterns of conduct that can be judicially or legislatively recognized. The necessary practices can be adopted when broader standards of conduct have emerged from retrospective judicial findings of similarity. This is what Edward Levy, in lecture number 2, called the moving classification system, resolving disputes, guiding public conduct. So Holmes's account of rule formation implies an environment of constant development and revision, rather than an always static landscape of clear and detailed utilitarian permission and impermissions. His rules emerge from extended normative inquiry and convergent practices that depend in detail on feedback from society into the resolution of recurring disputes. Multiple opposing arguments from utility will apply to early novel cases before eventual classification makes them irrelevant, as similarities of conduct are established and accepted. Various cues are transformed by the adaptive convergent definitions of the larger cue. You remember my diagram of the small cues and the larger cues. So that is the end of our lecture today. And next week, we'll get further into the issue of moral generalism and moral particularism and contemporary ethical theory. Thank you.
Obrigado, professor Kellogg. Obrigado a todos que estão participando e assistindo, aos estudantes inscritos nesse curso de extensão. Estamos avançando bem, né, nesse nosso curso de extensão, já com muitas palestras do professor, estamos na metade, né, e o professor Jorge e eu estamos fazendo as traduções dos textos que o professor vai enviando e a gente repassa para a secretaria assim que a gente tiver esses últimos, né, que o professor trouxe aqui nas palestras, tá certo? Qualquer dúvida que tenham, vocês podem enviar tanto no chat do YouTube, enquanto a gente tem as...
No, I pressed the hang up button.
I forgot there's a Zoom at 2:00 with the Library of Congress.
Oh, Zoom or is it?
Meeting Zoom, 2 o'clock. LOC. I'm looking at your calendar.
Yeah.
Is that the meeting about?
yeah.
But that's not with me. That's really about the discussion on your speakers or something.
Yes, that is. That's right. That's the meeting with Mark and
Professor Kellogg, are you?
Hello? Hello?
You are
Hello.
still here in the video conference.
I hung up.
Abraço. Obrigado, professor. Thank you.
Okay.
Ok, pessoal, então é isso. À medida em que a gente for traduzindo essas últimas palestras, a gente vai enviando para vocês. Eu espero que todos estejam aproveitando bastante. Qualquer dúvida, né, como eu disse, podem trazer à secretaria. Eu creio que vocês têm um grupo, né, em conjunto, tanto em termos do desenvolvimento do curso em si, de extensão, quanto alguma pergunta a respeito do conteúdo, tá? Ou da tradução, eventualmente. Fiquem à vontade. É isso, um abraço a todos e até a próxima segunda-feira.